We are outside a bookshop on Alderman Street, 10 at night, her name lit in the window behind her. She is looking at me. I am about to do something that cannot be undone. 6 months ago, I walked into this bookshop for someone else, sat in someone else's seat, and watched this woman understand that the person she expected had not come. I did not know it, but I was the one she had been waiting for. Not Priya. Me. She said she needed time. She resigned a 6-year position to make space for it. She came down 1 floor and told me she was deciding what survives. Now I reach up and touch her jaw. She breathes in. If you want to hear uncensored, too hot for YouTube stories, check out my Patreon in the description. Tell us where you are watching from and subscribe. My best friend stood up, the cold professor. She saw me picking up her things and said, "Keep them." The cold professor had been saving a seat at her own book launch, and the person she saved it for never came. I know because I was there. I wasn't supposed to be. I had my own evening planned, but Priya sent her emergency code at 7:43, meaning she wasn't coming, and someone had to go. Someone had to walk into that beautifully lit bookshop on Alderman Street, sit in the empty seat beside a woman I'd never spoken to, and watch her understand, in real time, that the person she expected had sent someone else. That someone was me. When she turned and looked at me, I knew Priya had not warned me about this woman. If you want to hear uncensored, too hot for YouTube stories, check out my Patreon in the description. Tell us where you are watching from and subscribe. I had met Priya Chakraborty in the queue for a poetry seminar neither of us had registered for in time, which was 10 years ago now, and I had spent most of those 10 years watching her talk herself into rooms she had no legitimate reason to occupy and out of them again before the damage became permanent. Priya was warm and magnetic and catastrophically impractical in personal matters, which she compensated for with an iron discipline in her clinical work. She was a surgical resident who had never once been late to a shift, but who could not be trusted to show up to a social commitment on time or to remember, entirely, whether she had told 2 different people about the same Saturday. She was my best friend and had been since our 2nd week of university, and I had made peace with the particular kind of love that requires picking up after someone while also admiring everything they refuse to be careful about. I was 28 and worked as deputy editor of a literary quarterly called The Read, which occupied a small suite of offices on the 2nd floor of the Humanities Building at St. Aldwyn's. I existed adjacent to the academic world rather than inside it. I met the professors, published their essays, attended the launches and the readings and the occasional departmental reception where someone would ask what I taught, and I would explain I was not faculty, and watch their interest recalibrate. I knew more about the departmental politics of 3 literature faculties than most of the people inside them, and I had learned to find that amusing. Ingrid Solberg was the chair of comparative literature. She occupied the 3rd floor directly above my offices. I knew her by name and reputation the way anyone working adjacent to a department knows its most visible people. She had published 3 books in 12 years. She sat on our review board. She was known for a quality of precision in lecture that graduate students either found electrifying or insufferable depending on their tolerance for being visibly wrong. She was 38, which I had not known until Priya told me, because Ingrid Solberg gave the impression of someone who existed outside of ordinary biographical time. Not ageless, but so fully arrived at herself that the usual markers felt decorative. I had never spoken to her. I had seen her at departmental receptions, standing with a glass of wine she barely touched, and a quality of focused attention that made any conversation in her vicinity feel more considered. She was the kind of person who made a room more interesting by being in it without appearing to try. Priya had been seeing her since October. She told me about it over dinner, with the careful casualness she used when she expected me to have opinions. They had met at a faculty hospital benefit in September, and Priya had, in her characteristic way, talked herself into a conversation with the most formidable person in the room and then extended it past the event's ending. Several late dinners had followed. "She's extraordinary," Priya had told me. "You've said that before," I said, "about the cardiothoracic consultant, about the architect." "This is different," Priya said. "It's always different," I said. She looked at me with genuine exasperation. "This woman has more interior weather than anyone I have ever met. She is the most private person who has consented to eat dinner with me. Every conversation is a negotiation and, somehow also, the most interesting thing that happened to me all week." "Are you actually seeing each other?" I asked. "Or are you having very stimulating dinner conversations?" Priya paused in the particular way that meant the distinction was unresolved. "The point is," she said, "it's serious. Or moving towards serious." In Priya's language, that meant, "I like this woman a great deal, and I am absolutely terrified of what that means for my schedule." The book launch was in January. Ingrid had a new collection of essays coming out, something on translation theory and the movement of meaning across languages, which Priya described as devastating in the best possible way, and the launch was at a bookshop on Alderman Street that did these things properly. Good wine, chairs in actual rows, a reading followed by a conversation with a critic who had read the whole book. Priya had been invited. She had told Ingrid she would be there. She had been called in for an emergency consult at 7:15 and sent me her emergency code at 7:43, which was a single number in a text with nothing else, meaning, "I cannot explain. There is a situation. If there is somewhere I am supposed to be, please cover it." I had the bookshop's address in an earlier text. I looked at it. I looked at the time. I went. The bookshop was warmly lit and 3/4 full when I arrived. I found the reserved front row seats immediately, 2 of them, a small paper card on each, and understood, in a quick, cold way, that Priya had not just been attending as a member of the public. She had been the person Ingrid had wanted in that specific seat. I took the empty seat. The card said Priya C. I turned it face down. Ingrid was at the back of the room speaking with the events director. She was in dark wide-legged trousers and a deep blue blouse with the collar open. The precise casualness of someone who had given thought to appearing thoughtless. Her hair was dark, and she wore it pinned, and she stood with the ease of someone who had spent years in front of audiences and had stopped performing ease and simply arrived at it. She turned when someone spoke to her, and her eyes did a circuit of the room and landed, briefly, on the front row. She registered the empty seat. She registered me. Something in her face did not change, which was itself information. She looked for one full second, not searching, not hoping, just noting, and then returned her attention to the events director. I sat very still and told myself this was completely manageable. The reading was 30 minutes. She read 2 essays from the collection, and I was caught immediately. Her voice was unhurried and deliberate, and she read her own prose with the specific authority of someone who had earned every sentence. The essays were about the space between languages, about what gets lost and what gets changed and what, against all odds, arrives intact when you carry meaning across a gap. There was a line near the end of the second piece about translation as an act of faith in meaning's endurance. The belief that enough survives the crossing to make the crossing worthwhile, and I wrote it on the back of my program because I was not ready to let it pass through me without record. I should have left during the signing. The sensible thing was to slip out during the applause and let the evening be an act of friendship accomplished and nothing more. I stayed. When Ingrid finished the last of the signing and looked up to find me still in the front row seat, she came to the chair beside mine and sat in it with the ease of someone who had finished everything the evening required. "You're not Priya," she said. "I am not," I said. She looked at me. Nothing accusatory, just the careful taking of information. I'm Mila, I said. Priya was called in for an emergency. She sent me. She's in the surgical program, Ingrid said. Yes. Then it was a real emergency. It always is with her, I said. A pause. The room was still warm and loud around us with post-event conversation. She said, You stayed for the whole reading. I did, I said. You wrote something down. I looked at the program in my lap. You were watching me write it, I said. I was watching the room, she said, with the matter-of-fact quality of someone describing neutral behavior. I turned the program over and showed her what I had written. Her own sentence. The one about the faith required for translation. She looked at it. I know this sentence, she said. I should hope so, I said. The corner of her mouth moved. 1 millimeter. It's the one that took the longest, she said. 9 rewrites over 2 weeks. The version you have is the 7th draft. I sat with that. Then I said, It's the right one. She held my gaze for a moment. Level, assessing, with an attention that felt different from the attentiveness she brought to the room in general. More specific, more particular. She said, Priya has told me about you. That's alarming, I said. In which direction? The corner of her mouth again. She said you worked at a quarterly, she said. She said you were the only person she knew who argued with her in good faith about things that mattered. I would argue with anyone in good faith, I said. Apparently not, she said. According to Priya, most people either agree with you immediately or stop engaging entirely. Priya is generous to me, I said. She was quiet for a moment. The wine glass she had been carrying all evening and had not drunk was still in her hand, the level unchanged. Thank you, she said, for coming. I didn't know what else to do with the address and the code, I said. Something in her expression shifted. Not warmth exactly, not distance, something more specific than either. She said, You can tell her the reading was well attended. She'll want to know. I'll tell her it was more than that, I said. She stood, clean, economical, said goodnight without emphasis, and walked toward the bookshop owner who was trying to reach her for a photograph. I sat in the front row seat with the program in my lap, and the January night visible through the window, and understood that I had just done something I had not been prepared for. I called Priya on my way home. Was she upset? Was it awful? Was she angry? She wasn't angry, I said. She read beautifully. You should have been there. Was she upset? She didn't show anything if she was. Priya exhaled. She never shows it. That's the whole problem and also the whole thing. Go back to your patient, I said. A beat of silence. Then Priya said, You liked her. I met her for 20 minutes. Which is not a no, said Priya. I went inside. 3 weeks passed. Priya rescheduled twice and finally saw Ingrid for dinner in early February, which seemed to go well based on 3 cryptic words in a text and an inexplicable photograph of the restaurant receipt. I thought about the book launch approximately less than I had the week after it, and approximately more than I should have the week after that. I worked in the humanities building. Ingrid's offices were on the 3rd floor above mine. I passed the comparative literature department every morning. I had done so for 2 years without incident. I was now doing so with a small, precise, inconvenient awareness that had not existed in December. This was manageable. This would resolve itself. In the 2nd week of February, Priya called with a favor. She had lent Ingrid 3 books, novels and an essay collection she had borrowed from my flat, and never returned before lending them again. She needed them back before the weekend. Could I go up to the Complit offices and collect them? I was in the building every day. It would take 10 minutes. Does she know you're sending me? I asked. I texted her, said Priya. She said it was fine. I went the following afternoon, between editorial meetings. The comparative literature offices smelled of paper and tea, and the particular warmth of institutional radiators working harder than necessary. The administrative office was staffed by a small woman named Beryl, who had outlasted 3 department chairs and regarded me with the mild benevolence she probably reserved for most interruptions that didn't require forms. I explained about the books. She said Professor Solberg was in her office and had said I could go up. The office was the last one on the left at the corridor's end. I knocked. A pause. Then, "Come in." The office was larger than I had imagined and less formal than I had expected from the person who occupied it. There were books. Not decorative books. Red books. Heavily annotated books with slips of paper and yellow tabs marking passages. A whiteboard covered in passages of French and German with arrows and notes around them. A desk at the window with a lamp that was on even in the afternoon, casting a particular warm steadiness against the February gray outside. Ingrid was at her desk. She looked up. For one moment. Exactly the length of a full breath. We looked at each other. Then she said, "The books are on the left shelf. Priya's things are marked with a yellow tab. I found them. 3 books with yellow paper visible between pages, all of them mine originally, all of them bearing Priya's pencil annotations in the margins. I took them off the shelf carefully, spine by spine, settling them into my bag. I was aware of her. I had known I would be aware of her in any room I was in with her, and I was simply moving through it. Careful, quiet, hands occupied with the task. I reached for the 3rd book, and something shifted on the shelf. A scarf tucked at the back of the space the books had occupied. Pale blue wool. Mine originally, then Priya's, bearing Priya's perfume faintly in the weave. I picked it up and folded it and tucked it under my arm. I turned to leave. Ingrid had not gone back to her work. She was watching me from her desk with the complete attention she seemed to bring to everything in her field of vision. "Keep them," she said. I looked at her. "Not the books," she said. "The books are Priya's. Keep the scarf." "It's Priya's scarf," I said. She held my gaze for a moment. Then she said, "Priya has decided she has other things to occupy her evenings now. I don't expect the scarf's owner to come and claim it." I was still. Then I said, "She ended things?" "Amicably," Ingrid said. "Last week, she has a colleague from the cardiothoracic department and the scheduling had become," she paused, "logistical." I stood in the middle of her office with 3 books under my arm and a pale blue scarf I had not come for, and understood slowly that Ingrid was telling me something I had not been sent here to receive. "I'm sorry," I said. "I didn't know." She looked at me. There was something in her face that was not entirely arranged into its usual order, not the composed version, but a version that had not been gathered back yet. She said, "Why are you sorry?" "Because," I said. And then I stopped. Because she deserved better than a text message about scheduling difficulties and a cardiothoracic colleague. But those were not things I was entitled to say, standing in a near stranger's office on an errand for the woman who had just ended it. "She should have told you in person," I said. A pause. "She told me by text," Ingrid said. I looked at the scarf in my hands. "Keep it," she said again. Not as an instruction, not as a closing line, as something simple she meant. I looked at her. She had turned back to her desk. The conversation was, apparently, concluded. I left with 3 books and a pale blue scarf I had not come for, and stood in the cold corridor outside her door for a moment that was longer than necessary, and I thought about the word simply, about how she had used it. "Keep it," she had said. Not, "You should take it." Not, "Priya won't want it back." Simply, "Keep it." As though the scarf had always been on a trajectory that ended here, in this particular corridor, with me holding it. I thought about the book launch, the reserved seat, the card turned face down, The sentence she had written 9 times and the version I had written on the back of a program, and neither of us had said anything about it being the same sentence. I had been treating all of those things as coincidences of the interesting kind rather than the significant kind, which is a thing a person does when they have decided provisionally not to know something yet. Standing in the corridor with the pale blue wool in my hands and the smell of Priya's perfume fading in the institutional cold, I thought, I am going to have to decide whether to know this. I folded the scarf more carefully than it needed to be folded and put it in my bag and walked back to the second floor. I did not tell Priya about the scarf. I delivered the books that evening and we had the post-mortem over wine, Priya managing the gap between what she felt and what she wanted to feel, which was the particular kind of conversation she handled with alcohol and carefulness. "She's extraordinary," I said. "You said she was extraordinary." "She is," said Priya, "but I couldn't give her what she needs. She deserves someone whose head is actually in it. I'm pulling 90-hour weeks until the end of the year." "You didn't give her a chance to decide that for herself?" I said. Priya looked at me. "You're annoyed." "I'm not annoyed." "You're doing the very even and precise thing." "That's you're annoyed." I said nothing. Priya refilled her glass and leaned back on my sofa. "Mila. She is not cold. She's private. She's built around precision because caring costs her something real, and she's only careful because of that. The day I said it in person, she would have looked at me with that way she has. You know the way. And she would have said something exact and correct, and I would not have been able to leave. "So you chose the coward's version?" I said. Priya looked at the window. "I know," she said quietly. I thought about the office, the lamp on against the February gray, something not yet arranged in her face before it settled back into order. The way she had said keep it, the way she had meant it. "She'll be fine," I said. "Probably." "Yes," said Priya. "Probably." We sat with that for a moment. The flat was quiet around us. The particular quietness of a city evening in February, when the heating is on, and the windows are darkened and the wine is 3/4 gone. Priya said, "You know what I keep thinking about?" I said, "Tell me," she said, "at the first dinner." October. She told me about a paper she was translating for a conference, and she described the problem in the original text. A passage about grief that doesn't survive translation into English without losing the specific quality of grief it describes. And I asked her why she was translating it at all, if something essential couldn't survive. And she looked at me for a long time before she answered. I said, "What did she say?" Priya said, "She said that what survives is not the grief, but the fact of its having existed. That the translation is an act of witness even when it is also an act of loss." And the way she said it, she was not performing it. She was not being academic about it. She was simply saying the true thing in the language that was closest to accurate, and it was extraordinary. I held my wine glass. I said, "And you ended it by text." Priya looked at the floor. I said, "I'm not saying it to be cruel. I'm saying it because you know exactly what you did." She said, "I know exactly what I did." Neither of us said anything for a while. Outside, the street sounds were the usual London sounds, distant and continuous. She said, "Take care of the scarf." I looked at her. She said, "I mean it. It's a good scarf. It deserves someone who will take care of it." The spring semester at St. Aldwyn's moved with the rhythm of academic life. Lectures compressed before Easter, departmental events, the particular pressure of a journal issue that needed closing while the faculty was generating twice the usual number of submissions. I passed the comparative literature corridor every morning. I did so now with the inconvenient awareness that had started in January and had not resolved itself the way I had told myself it would. I saw Ingrid at 2 departmental events in March, At the first, she acknowledged me with the minimal nod of professional contexts, and we spent the rest of the evening in separate conversations that occupied the same room. At the second, a panel on contemporary literary criticism in the humanities lecture hall. She arrived after me, and, instead of the reserved faculty seats near the front, sat 2 rows ahead of mine. After the panel ended and I was still in my seat reviewing notes, she came to the back of the room. "You disagreed with the third argument," she said. I looked up. She was standing in the aisle with her jacket over one arm. "What?" I said. "You wrote something down," she said. "And then, you drew a line through it." She had been right. I had made a note about the third speaker's claim regarding the disappearance of the author in translation and had, 30 seconds later, identified the problem with it. "You were watching me," I said. "You were 2 rows back," she said. "My peripheral vision is professional grade. That's an interesting quality for a literature professor to develop." The corner of her mouth, 1 millimeter. "What was the argument?" she said. "About the author disappearing in translation," I said. "The claim was incomplete. The author doesn't disappear. The author becomes present differently. A version of them is what survives the crossing. That's not disappearance. That's transformation." She looked at me for a moment. Then, "That's the central argument of the second essay in the collection." I had read the whole collection, I realized, not just the 2 pieces she had read at the launch. I had read it and absorbed her argument so fully that I had arrived at it independently when the occasion demanded it. "I've read your book," I said. "I didn't realize I was restating you." "That's not restating," she said. "That's arriving at the same place independently. Is that different?" "It depends on whether you're interested in the question or in having the right answer," she said. She said, "Do you have the next hour?" I had the next hour. We went to the cafe on the ground floor, run by a man named Graham who produced Ingrid's order without being asked. We sat at the window table in the March gray and talked for 55 minutes. About translation, about what it means for meaning to survive movement, about whether intimacy was always a form of it, about her second book, and the one review of it she had clearly not forgiven. She engaged with disagreement the way a precise thinker should, not to win, but to find the actual edge of what was true, and I watched her think in front of me, which was different from performing intelligence, which was more interesting and somehow more exposing. I told her it was good to talk to someone who read things rather than about them. She looked at me over her coffee. She had been drinking it, not just holding it. "Priya told me you took this position because you wanted to stay inside books without disappearing into academia," she said, "and that she argued with you about it for a month." "She won several rounds," I said, "but not the argument." She said, "The work you select has a coherence the previous issues lacked. I've read back through the archive." She had read the archive. "Before we met. Back through it." I said, "When?" "Over the autumn," she said. "Before the current volume." I said, "Before the launch?" "Yes." I said, "Why?" She was quiet for a moment. Then, "The review board meets twice a year. I like to understand the work of the publications I advise. That's a professional answer," I said. She looked at me. Then she said, "I have a seminar in 20 minutes." "I know," I said. "I've been watching the clock." She looked at me again. There was something in it that was less composed than her usual looking. The half-second before she gathered it back was visible, if you were watching for it. She said, "You can walk past my office, if you want to continue the conversation." Not an invitation exactly, an acknowledgement of what was already true, that we were in the same building every day and that the March afternoon had just lasted 55 minutes and neither of us had been watching the clock until the last 5. "I'll walk past," I said. She went to her seminar. I sat for a long time over the last of my coffee and thought about the word independently. About arriving at the same place independently. About whether that was At this point, still the right word. She had a seminar on Tuesdays at 3. I knew this because I had learned, without deliberately intending to, most of her weekly schedule: the departmental meeting on Monday mornings, the office hours on Wednesdays, the research afternoons she protected on Fridays with a closed door that everyone on the third floor had apparently learned not to knock on. I knew the schedule the way you know a thing you have been paying attention to longer than you admitted, in the particular way of someone who has been filing information without choosing to. The Tuesday after the cafe conversation, I was coming up from the post room with a stack of submissions when I passed the comp-lit seminar room door, which stood ajar, and heard her voice. I stopped. There was no professional reason to stop outside a literature seminar with submissions under my arm and nowhere to be until 4 o'clock. I stopped anyway. She was reading aloud. A passage from Proust. The involuntary memory section, the Madeleine, the taste, and the years that collapse into a single moment of recognition. And she read it in the same unhurried way she read her own prose, with the specific authority of someone who had been in conversation with a text for long enough to stop performing it and simply inhabit it. Then she stopped reading. There was a silence that had the quality of a room full of people holding their breath. She said, "What does it cost you to understand this passage? Not what does it mean? Not what is Proust arguing? What does it cost you?" I heard someone in the room make a tentative start on the literary critical version of an answer. Thesis, historical context, the tradition of involuntary memory in the French novel. She let them finish. Then she said, "That is what the passage means to the essay." I asked what it costs you. No one spoke for a moment. Then a different voice, quieter, said, "You lose the ability to pretend the past is finished." A pause. She said, "Yes. That is it, exactly." I stood in the corridor for 3 full minutes. I know it was 3 minutes because by the time I started walking again, I was late for my own desk and had not noticed the time passing at all, which had not happened to me, standing in a corridor in the previous 28 years of my life. Walking past became a pattern before either of us named it as one. Her door open, my footsteps on the stairs, a conversation that settled naturally into 10 or 20 minutes before the day required us back to our separate floors. She began leaving the Reed's new issues in the stack beside her desk lamp. She began returning them with passages underlined and questions in the margins. Not corrections, not editorial critique, just the marks of a genuine reader who could not encounter a text without responding to it. The morning she disagreed with my editorial note on the Halverson poem was a Thursday in late April. The note was 2 sentences at the bottom of the page, the kind of brief contextualizing comment I added to pieces whose formal choices I thought needed a frame for readers less familiar with the tradition. She picked up the issue, read it through, and set it down. "You flattened it," she said. I said, "I contextualized it." "You told the reader how to read it," she said. "The poem doesn't need that. It needs to be left alone with the reader for a minute before anyone intervenes. I had been editing literary journals for 5 years. I said, "The note gives the reader something to hold on to." She said, "The reader already has something to hold on to. The poem. Your note tells them the poem is difficult before they find out for themselves whether it is." I sat with that for a moment. I looked at the note in the printed issue. I thought about the argument for approximately 30 seconds. "You're right," I said. She looked at me with a slight quality of surprise, not at the concession itself but at the speed of it. I said, "I wrote it for the wrong reader." I was imagining someone who doesn't read poetry, rather than someone who does. She said, "That is a more useful version of the same problem." I said, "I'll take it." The corner of her mouth. The morning she was working on a translation problem was a Friday in early May. She had a page of German on the desk and a page of English beside it, and had been sitting with both for some time before I walked past, which I could tell from the fact that the coffee she had made was cold. I came in without being asked, moved the coffee cup to the window ledge where it was not in my line of sight and therefore not my problem, and sat down. She said, without preamble, "This compound word." She pointed at a phrase on the German page. "It doesn't have an English equivalent and everything I've tried loses a different part of it." "What does it mean?" I said. "It means..." She paused. "The feeling of recognizing something you have never seen before. The specific quality of the familiar arriving inside the unfamiliar." I thought about it. Then I said, "What about the knowing that was already there? Not the recognition itself, but the sense that you already knew, before you knew." She looked at me. I said, "It's not a single word. But it's a phrase. The knowing that was already there." She wrote it down. She looked at what she had written for a long moment. She said, "That is almost exactly right." I said, "Almost." She said, "The German carries more weight than English allows, but almost is considerably better than everything else I have tried." I took the cold coffee from the window ledge on my way out. I heard her behind me, already back at the German page, the sound of a pen moving across paper. Theo, my editorial assistant, told me I had been arriving at 8:30 instead of 9. "I like the building when it's quiet," I said. He looked at me in the way of 23-year-olds who have read enough novels to recognize situations before the people in them do. "The professor from the 3rd floor came down looking for a back issue last week," he said. "The building has a lending system." "I know it has a lending system," I said. "She bypassed it," said Theo. He went back to his proofs. I opened my computer and thought about what he had said for approximately 40 seconds before deciding, carefully and deliberately, not to think about it. Ruth Caldecott found me in the corridor on my way back from the post room the following Thursday. She was 62 years old and had the unhurried authority of someone who had watched academic departments function and malfunction for long enough to find them neither surprising nor alarming. She had published 5 books, supervised more doctoral students than she could count without checking a list, and was known among junior faculty for never saying anything that was not precisely what she meant. She said, "You edit the quarterly on the 2nd floor." I said, "Yes." She said, "I've read the last 3 issues. They are stronger than the issues before them. The work you select has an argument rather than a preference." I thanked her. She said, "Ingrid talks about the editorial choices you make. She does not usually discuss colleagues' work unprompted." I looked at her. Ruth had gray eyes and the particular quality of unhurried attention I had now encountered in at least 2 people in this building, and had come to associate with a specific kind of mind, one that did not need to perform observation, because observation had long ago become simply the default mode of being present. She said, "She came to St. Aldwyn's a long time ago, under difficult circumstances, and built everything she has here very carefully. She is not someone who takes risks with what she has built, unless she is certain of what she is risking it for." I held her gaze and said nothing. She said, "I'm offering that as context, not as counsel. You seem like someone who finds context useful." She picked up the stack of papers she had been carrying and continued down the corridor without looking back. I stood where she had left me for a long time. The corridor hummed around me with the particular afternoon quiet of a building that had been doing the same work, in the same way, for a very long time, and had no particular anxiety about it. The departmental reading series in April was the first time I watched Ingrid in front of an audience since the book launch, and it was different in the way that watching someone in their working element is always different once you have also seen the private version of them. She was introducing a poet in residence, and she did it the way she did everything: precise, unhurried, making the ordinary feel considered. But I was in the 4th row, and I had learned, by now, to watch the edges. Priya had been right. The edges were there if you knew to look. The half-second before she glanced at her notes. The single moment at the introduction's end when she found the room before speaking the last line. The quality of the finding that was not performance, but genuine wish. She wanted to be received. It cost her something to want that, and the cost showed at the margins in ways that only someone watching closely would catch. She saw me when she looked up at the close of the introduction. I was already watching her. She did not show it publicly. Afterward, when the reception had thinned and most of the room had moved toward the wine table or the exit, she found me near the bookshelf at the back. "You watched the whole introduction," she said. "I was taking notes," I said. "You were not taking notes." "I had a pen," I said. "You had a pen," she agreed. We stood in the space near the bookshelf where the reading lamps cast amber light, and the noise of the reception was a wall at the far end of the room. She said, "Your review of his work in the last issue. The third paragraph." "I know which one you mean," I said. "What made you write it that way?" I said. "About grief being the only lyric occasion that takes up the whole body? I wrote it the week after my grandmother died. At 2 a.m, I filed it the next day and realized I had put the true thing in without meaning to." She was quiet. "It's the best paragraph in the issue," she said. "I know," I said. "I almost cut it." "Why?" "Too personal for a review," I said, "but I couldn't find the version of it that wasn't." She looked at me with what I recognized now as the specific expression of recognition, the acknowledgement of someone who has heard the thing they thought only they knew. She said, "I almost cut the 7th draft." "The sentence from the launch," I said. "The one that took 9 rewrites." "Yes." She said it simply. "Why did you keep it?" "Because I couldn't find the version that wasn't," she said. We stood there, the amber light, the noise at the far end of the room, close enough that the conversation was contained between us without effort. I said, "I'd like to have that coffee again." She was quiet for a moment. "My office at 9 tomorrow," she said, not a question. The 9 o'clock became a standing arrangement through April and into May, established without formalization, simply there, her door open, my footsteps on the stairs, coffee from somewhere, always appearing, once from outside the building in a paper cup she must have gone for before I arrived, which I did not comment on because there was no comment that would not have named something neither of us was yet naming. We argued, which was the best thing. She engaged with disagreement as genuine inquiry rather than a position to defend, her conclusions adjusting where the evidence required it, mine doing the same. She was not cold. I had been watching long enough to know the difference between cold and careful, and I knew which one she was. In mid-May, the read hosted a visiting essayist named Piera Landi, whose work I had championed through a difficult editorial process. Ingrid was on the response panel. I was in the audience. After the panel, in the backstage room where the panelists collected their things, I was speaking with Piera when I caught a fragment of Ingrid's voice behind me. She was talking to Ruth Caldecott, the senior professor on the floor, the department's institutional memory. And what I caught was, she's edited the last 3 volumes as a coherent argument, rather than a collection of pieces. That's not something you manufacture. Ruth said something I missed. Ingrid said, more quietly, "I know." I did not hear the question. I knew what the answer carried. Piera tapped my arm. "Your face is doing something," she said. "Is it?" I said. "Something," said Piera with a small, understanding smile. After the reception thinned, Ingrid found me by the window. Dark jacket, a blouse the color of late summer light. She looked, I had to be honest with myself, remarkable. I was going to have to stop being honest with myself about that. Or do something about it. One of the two. She said, "Your editorial decision on Landy's 3rd essay." The concluding section. The conclusion was the writer doing the thinking the essay had already done, I said. The piece stood better without it. "I've read the original," she said. "You were right." "You've read the original?" "I have a correspondence with the author," she said. "He mentioned the editorial process." I stared at her. He was not wrong to trust you with it, she said. That's a very specific thing to say, I said. She met my eyes. I know. The reception had nearly emptied around us. The nearest lamp was casting the kind of light that makes conversations feel more private than the room warrants. I said, "Why do you read every issue?" Back through the archive before we even spoke, and every issue since. Why do you know what's in the work I edit? She was quiet for a moment. She said, "Because the editorial philosophy and the work it produces are worth following closely." That's a professional answer, I said. Yes, she said. Ingrid, I said. She said nothing, but she stayed where she was. I said, "We have been having coffee in your office for 6 weeks. You read my journal before that. You sat 2 rows behind me at the criticism panel specifically to watch me take notes. You left your own book launch through the signing to sit beside me." Her jaw set. The composure was working visibly harder than usual, the tightening at the edges, the slight shift in her shoulders, the cost of it showing in ways I had spent months learning to read. I said, "I am not asking you to say something you're not ready to say. I'm asking whether I'm misreading this completely." A long silence. The last of the reception's guests moved past us toward the door. She said, "You are not misreading it." I held very still. She said, "And it is a situation I have not." She paused with the specific pause of choosing exact words rather than approximations. "Determine the appropriate response to." "For several reasons I am fully aware of." "Tell me the reasons," I said. She said, "You work in this building. You were brought into my life through Priya, who ended her involvement with me 3 months ago, and I—" She paused again. "I do not want what I feel to resemble displacement." "Does it feel like displacement?" I asked. A long pause. The room around us was almost empty now. "No," she said. "Then it isn't," I said. She looked at me. I said, "The 9 o'clocks are not about Priya. They were never about Priya." The book launch stopped being about Priya after the first 10 minutes. I know the difference between filling a vacancy and finding something. I need you to know that I know that. Her throat moved. A small thing. Significant. She said, "I need time." I said, "I know." She said, "I don't mean." She stopped. "I mean, I want to do this with the care that it requires. Not because I'm not." She stopped again. "Because I am." I looked at her. She was telling me the truest thing she knew how to say in the language she had built herself in, the language of careful pauses and precisely chosen words, and the negative space between them that carried the weight of what the words themselves could not hold. She was telling me, "I feel what you are feeling and I want to not be afraid of it first." I said, "I understand." She said, "Good night, Mila." I said, "Good night." She left. I stood in the nearly empty room with the lamplight and the smell of wine and warm paper in the air, and I thought about the way she had said my name. Not clipped, not cold, precise in the way that meant something real was being kept carefully inside it. There was a quarterly issue to close by Friday. There were reader queries in my inbox. There were, in short, approximately 20 practical things I was professionally obligated to be thinking about. I thought about my name in her voice for a long time instead. June arrived in the way June always arrived at St. Aldwyn's, with the concentrated intensity of a semester ending. Essay submissions and grade sheets and the particular energy of a building trying to empty itself before the summer took hold. The humanities block had a specific quality in these final weeks. Doors that had been open since September beginning to close, the corridor conversations growing shorter, the common room coffee going untouched as everyone found reasons to be elsewhere. Ingrid's door was closed on Tuesday. It was open again on Thursday. I did not go in on Thursday because the door being open after being closed felt like a test of something I had not yet decided how to pass. The 9 o'clock arrangements had become irregular after the Piera Landi evening. Not absent, she was still there when I walked past. Still said something about the current issue or a translation problem she had been turning over. Still handed back the journals with her notes in the margins. But the quality of the time had changed in the way that things change when someone is being careful in a new and different way from the careful they had been before. She was managing the time. I had learned to recognize it when she managed things. I managed my own things in return. I closed the summer issue. I commissioned 3 pieces for autumn. I attended a conference in Edinburgh for 2 days in the second week of June, where I had productive editorial conversations and ate extremely good fish, and returned to St. Aldwyn's on a Friday afternoon with a rolling bag and the particular tiredness of trains and platforms. At the conference, I attended a panel on the politics of editorial selection in small literary journals. The panelists were all, in different ways, circling the same question I had been thinking about since March without using the words I would have chosen. The difference between choosing work because you believe in it and choosing it because it reflects something you want to be true about yourself. I ate dinner alone the first evening in a restaurant near the conference venue that was slightly too well lit and served extremely good fish. I was eating it with the particular focused pleasure of eating alone in a city that is not yours, where no one knows you, when Priya called at 8:30. She had 10 minutes between shifts. She wanted to know if I was eating properly. "I'm eating sole," I said. "It's very good." A pause. She said, "How's Edinburgh?" "Cold. The conference is good." She said, "You've never called a conference good before without me asking specifically." I said, "This one has a good panel on editorial selection." Priya said, "Mila, she left a book on your desk while you were gone." Beryl texted me. I set down my fork. "Beryl texted you," I said. "She's been doing it since October," said Priya. She said the book was a first edition and Professor Solberg brought it down herself, and it had a note inside. In her handwriting. I looked at the wall of the Edinburgh restaurant for a moment. I said, "Beryl texts you about this." Priya said, "She outlasted 3 department chairs. She keeps track of things." I said, "I don't know what to do with this information." Priya said, "Mila, a woman left a first edition on your desk with a handwritten note while you were away, and you are in Edinburgh eating sole alone. And I think both of those things deserve more attention than you are giving them." I picked my fork back up. I said, "I'll call you when I'm home." She said, "I know. Eat the rest of your fish. Theo told me someone had left something on my desk while I was away. It was a book. A slim collection of contemporary essays on translation, newly published from a press in Berlin. Inside the front cover, in handwriting that was precise and slightly compressed, a note, something in the second essay. Page 41. I.S. I read the second essay on my lunch break. Page 41 had a passage marked faintly in pencil, a paragraph about the essential loneliness of translation, the way the translator exists in the gap between 2 languages and belongs fully to neither, making the crossing possible for everyone else while remaining, themselves, on the far shore. I read it twice. Then I sat with the slim book in my hands and understood that Ingrid Solberg was, in her way, telling me something. The language she used for everything that mattered was the language of texts. Pages marked, passages underlined, notes left in margins. She was using it now, and she had not been careless about the choice. I went upstairs. Her door was open. She was at her desk. She looked up. "Page 41, I said. She held my gaze. I said, "Is that how it feels to you?" A pause, long enough that I counted it. She said, "Sometimes, less than it used to." I looked at her. Then I said, "Thank you for the book." She said, "There are 3 other essays in it." I said, "I'll read them." She said, "The 4th one answers the 2nd. I said, "I'll read it tonight." She looked at me for one moment. Something in her face that was not composed but was not open either. Something hovering at the edge of both. And then she looked at her desk. I left. I read the fourth essay that evening. It was about the moment of arrival. The translator reaching the far shore and discovering that the crossing had changed them, that they had become someone who carried both languages and belonged fully to neither, and therefore to something larger than either. It was not a sad essay. It was, unexpectedly, a very hopeful one. I put it on the stack of things I kept beside my own desk and did not go upstairs the next morning. Some responses required time to deserve. I read the fourth essay twice more over the following 2 days. The second time I underlined nothing because I had already underlined the whole thing in my mind, and repetition seemed beside the point. The essay argued that arrival was not the end of the crossing, but the beginning of a different kind of translation. The translation of everything you had carried through the gap into the language of wherever you now found yourself. That becoming bilingual in this sense was not a loss of the original self, but the achievement of a self large enough to hold both versions. That the translator on the far shore was not diminished by the crossing but expanded by it. I sat with the essay for 2 days. Then I wrote the note, bought the book on archives, and left it with Beryl. Priya came to my flat that Saturday. She sat on my sofa and looked at the book on the side table and picked it up and looked at the inscription and put it down with the face of someone who had known what was happening for several months and was just now receiving official confirmation. She said nothing. I said, "Don't." She said I wasn't going to say anything. I said, "You were about to say I told you so." She said, "I was going to say I'm glad. There's a difference." I looked at her. She said, "Mila." She left the book herself. "While you were in Edinburgh, she went out of her way to go to your floor and leave it on your desk with a note. That is a woman making a decision." I said, "She said she needed time." Priya said, "It's been 3 weeks." I said, "That's not very much time." Priya looked at me with the exasperated love she reserved for conversations where I was being deliberately obtuse. "You have been watching this woman, and she has been watching you since January," she said. "That is 6 months of time. The 3 weeks is the paperwork." I went to the bookshop on Alderman Street on Sunday. I found a collection of essays on the relationship between archives and memory, something I had been meaning to read for months and had kept not buying. I brought it home, wrote a note, and left it with Beryl on the 3rd floor on Monday morning. Something in the 3rd essay. Page 63. M.O. I went back to my own floor and did not think about it. She knocked on my door at 10:15. I looked up from my proofs. She was standing in the doorway of my editorial office for the first time in 2 years of working in the same building. She had the essay collection in her hand. "Page 63, she said. I said, "There's a passage about the archivist's problem, whether to preserve everything or to curate what survives." She looked at me. I said, "I thought it was relevant." She came into the office. She sat in the chair across from my desk. The editorial chair where contributors sat, where I talked to writers about their work. And she set the book down on the desk between us and looked at me across it. "This is," she said carefully, "the most deliberate conversation I have been in for some time." I said, "We speak in texts. That seems fair." She was quiet. Then she said, "The 4th essay in the Berlin collection. You read it?" I said, "Last Friday." She said, "What did you think?" I said, "I thought it was hopeful in a way I hadn't expected." She held my gaze across the desk. In my office, in the morning light that came through the 2nd floor windows and fell across the stacks of proofs and the wall of submissions and the general organized evidence of the work I did every day, she looked different than she looked on the 3rd floor. Less architectural, more present. She said, I stepped down from the review board. I stared at her. She said, "I submitted the resignation last week. I told the editor that the advisory relationship had become," she paused, "complicated by a personal connection, and that I was removing myself to preserve the integrity of both." "You didn't have to do that," I said. She looked at me steadily. Yes, I did, she said. You work here. I advise here. The two things cannot coexist with what this has been. I should have done it earlier. I did it now. I looked at her. The woman who had been composure personified for every moment I had known her, sitting across my editorial desk and telling me she had stepped down from a position she had held for 6 years because she wanted to be a person rather than a professional function in my vicinity. I said, "That is not a small thing to do." She said, "No, it isn't." I said, "Why now?" She said, "Because I read the passage you marked on page 63, and I understood that you were asking me a specific question." "What question?" She said, "Whether I was going to preserve everything or decide what survives." The morning was doing something useful to the light in the room, and Ingrid Solberg was sitting in my editorial chair, and I thought about the 7 drafts and the 9 rewrites and the translation gap and the far shore. I said, "What are you deciding?" She said, "I am deciding that 6 months of 9 o'clocks and books left on desks and arriving at the same arguments independently is not something I want to archive. I want it to be current." I looked at her for a long time. I said, "You're going to have to say the actual words eventually." She said, "I know," I said. "Not today, necessarily." She said, "I know." A pause. Something in the room had shifted. Not the tension, which was still present, but the quality of it. Less like a closed door, more like a door standing open and someone deciding whether to come through. She said, "Have dinner with me." "Not coffee," I said. "Not coffee," she said. "When?" "Saturday," she said. "Not as colleagues, not as people in the same building who argue about translation." She paused, and the pause was the most honest thing she had said yet. "As whatever we are?" I said, "Yes." She stood. She was smooth about it, but not quite as smooth as usual. A small extra moment before she put the movement together, which I had learned was the physical equivalent of the jaw flex, the thing that only showed when the composure was working harder than the situation required. She picked up the essay collection from my desk and held it for a moment. She said, "The 3rd essay is very good." I said, "I know. That's why I marked it." The corner of her mouth. She left. Theo appeared in my doorway approximately 45 seconds later. He said, "Was that the professor from the 3rd floor?" "Yes," I said. "In your office?" he said. "She returned a book," I said. He said, "That's not what it looked like." "Theo," I said. He went back to his desk. Saturday was the 21st of June, the longest day, which I noted at the time without deciding what to do with it. I arrived at the restaurant at 7. She was already there, which I had expected. Ingrid Solberg was the kind of person who arrived before she was expected and used the extra minutes to be prepared rather than anxious. She was in a dark shirt and black trousers, and her hair was down. I had heard Priya describe her hair as a signal once, back in October, without fully understanding what she meant. Standing in the entrance of the restaurant watching Ingrid see me across the room, I understood it now. Her hair being down meant she was not wearing the professional version of herself. She had decided, before I arrived, that tonight she was not going to be that. She stood when I reached the table. A small formality that was not professional but personal, the distinction visible in the way she stood. We sat down. She said, "You look nervous." I said, "You look like you know it." She said, "I've been here for 15 minutes. I had time to manage it." I said, "That is the most honest thing you have said to me in 6 months." She looked at me. Then she said, "I've been honest with you." I said, "In the language you know." "Yes." A pause. The waiter came. We ordered without much discussion. She already knew what she wanted, which I had expected. I said, "Tell me something I don't know. Not about books, not about translation. Something real." She picked up her wine glass. She put it down without drinking. she said. I came to St. Aldwyn's because I was running from something. Not a job, a relationship. I had been with someone for 6 years who believed that my precision was a performance, that if she waited long enough, the real version would emerge. And when I couldn't become the version she had been waiting for, she decided I had been deceiving her all along. She left. I took the St. Aldwyn's chair because it was the right distance from everything I knew, and I told myself the distance would resolve things. It mostly did. I looked at her. I said, "How long ago was that?" 7 years, she said. I said, "Is that why Priya was—" She said, "Priya is warm and direct and doesn't wait for the real version because she assumes the version she encounters is the one there is. It was—" She paused. "It was what I needed at a particular moment to believe was possible." I said, "And then she ended it by text." She said, "She ended it by text." I said, "I'm sorry." She looked at me. "You apologized for that in my office in February," she said. "I know," I said. "I'm still sorry." She was quiet for a moment. I said, "She told me, that night on my sofa, that she would not have been able to leave if she had done it in person, that the way you look at things would have made leaving impossible." Ingrid was very still. I said, "I need you to know that I understand that I've been watching you look at things for 6 months, and I understand why leaving would feel impossible." She said, "Mila." I said, "I know. I'm not asking you to say it tonight." She said, "I want to." I looked at her. She said, "I have been wanting to say it since March. The problem is not that I don't know what to say. The problem is that I know exactly what it costs when the person I say it to has not decided what they want yet, and I have been—" She stopped. "I have been waiting to be certain that what you feel is not proximity, not circumstance, not the particular situation of having been sent to a book launch in someone else's seat." I said, "It isn't." She said, "I know." I said, "Then why haven't you said it?" She said, "Because knowing and believing are not the same thing, and I have been learning to believe it." The restaurant was warm around us, and the June evening was still light through the window, the long, slow, reluctant light of the longest day. And across the table, Ingrid Solberg was telling me she had been afraid. Not of me, of being certain and being wrong again. I said, "What would help you believe it?" She was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "This. This already has." I held that for a moment. I said, "You stepped down from the review board." She said, "Yes." I said, "That was not a small thing." She said, "I know what it costs professionally. I chose it because the alternative was continuing to occupy 2 positions simultaneously and pretending they didn't affect each other. And I have been pretending things don't affect me for 7 years, and I am—" She stopped. "I am tired of the pretending." I looked at her across the table. The precise woman who had arrived at the same arguments independently and left a book on my desk and sat in my editorial chair to tell me she had resigned a position she had held for 6 years, who was sitting across from me on the longest day of the year with her hair down and her wine untouched and telling me she was tired. I said, "Say it." She looked at me. I said, "Not because I need to hear it, because you said you want to, and wanting to is enough." Something in her face moved. Not the millimeter thing, not the jaw flex. Something more substantial. Something that had been building behind the composure for the whole 6 months and was gathering itself to come forward. She said, "I have wanted to say something true to you since the moment you sat down in Priya's seat in January and turned the card face down and stayed for the whole reading. And the true thing is that I am—" She stopped. "That I have been—" She stopped again. "That you are—" She stopped a 3rd time. I said, "Take as long as you need." She said, "I'm in love with you. I have been in love with you since March." possibly since February, possibly since you showed me what you had written on the back of a program in a bookshop in January, and it turned out to be the sentence I most cared about having written. And I have been managing it and structuring it and finding the appropriate response to it for 4 months. And the appropriate response is apparently dinner on the longest day of the year and telling you the truth. I said nothing for a moment. She looked at me. The composure was present, but it was holding something different now. Not distance, just steadiness. The composure as a foundation rather than a wall. I said, I've been in love with you since about the middle of March. I know this because that's when I started arriving at 8:30. She looked at me. I said, Theo noticed. The corner of her mouth, more than a millimeter. A whole smile almost, contained at the edge of her composure. She said, I know. He left a note for Beryl. I said, Beryl told you? She said, Beryl tells me everything. I stared at her. She said, she has outlasted 3 department chairs. She knows what she's doing. I looked at her. This woman who was telling me the building's administrator had been tracking my arrival times and reporting them upstairs. Who had just said the truest thing in 4 months of almost truths and had said it precisely, without decoration, and was now looking at me with something in her eyes that was not composed and not managed and simply, entirely, present. I said, I would like to reach across this table. She said yes. I reached across the table. She met me halfway. We sat like that for a long time, her hand in mine, the evening light doing its long June work outside the window. I said, You're going to have to let me argue with you about things. She said, You argue with me constantly. I find it useful. I said, That's not the same as letting it happen personally. She said, I know the difference. I said, Do you? She said, I have been letting you argue with me personally since March. I have been adjusting my positions where your evidence required it. That is the personal version. I looked at her. I said, You're going to have to tell me when you're managing something instead of just managing it. She said, That is going to require practice. I said, I know. I'm asking you to practice it with me. She held my hand across the table. She said, I can do that? I said, and you're going to have to stop bypassing the lending system. She said, Beryl told you about that too. I said, Theo told me. He has his own sources. The smile again. More than the corner this time. Full, private, directed entirely at me. She said, The book I left on your desk is a first edition. I said, I know. I looked it up. She said, You can keep it. I said, I know. You said keep it. She looked at me. There was something in her eyes that was the thing she had been managing since January. Not managed now, just present. Warm and specific, and directed at me with the complete attention she had always brought to the things she cared most about. It was not soft, which was always going to be true about her, the way precision and care are not soft, but are not cold either. And I had been learning the difference for 6 months and was prepared to keep learning it indefinitely. We left the restaurant at 10. The June evening was still light, the gift of the longest day, and we walked without a particular destination through the city that was quieter in the summer and easier to move through and full of the kind of lingering light that makes everything look like it has already been resolved. She did not take my hand on the street. She walked beside me with the small, deliberate space between us that was not distance, but awareness. The awareness of 2 people who had just said something true and were living inside the saying of it and did not want to rush past the arriving. We came to the Alderman Street bookshop. Closed at this hour. The same warm gold of the window display. The same chairs still arranged in rows inside, and in the front corner, the display of her essay collection. She stopped. I stopped beside her. She said, The front row. I said, The front row. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, I saw you turn the card face down. I was watching from the back of the room when you came in. I watched you find the seat and read the card and turn it over. I said, I know you were watching. You looked for 1 second and then turned back to the events director. She said, I thought. She turned the card face down. She's going to stay. I said, I almost didn't stay. She said, I know. I could see you deciding. I said, could you? She said, you go very still when you are making a decision rather than having made one. I've learned to recognize it. I looked at her. The bookshop window behind her, the chairs in rows inside, the small light above the display, her own name on the cover of the collection visible from where we stood on the pavement. I said, what would you have done if I had left? She said, I would have conducted the rest of the evening correctly and gone home, and not admitted to myself that it was a disappointment. I said, but it would have been. She said, yes. I reached up and touched her jaw. She breathed in. I said, I'd like to stop being careful. She said, yes. I kissed her. It was not frantic. It was patient in the way of things that have been earned by everything that came before them. All the 9 o'clocks and the margins and the 7th draft and the front row seat and the pale blue scarf and the books left on desks and the dinner on the longest day of the year. Her hand settled at my waist and we simply stayed there, and all the restraint that had defined everything between us finally became something honest rather than withheld. We stood outside the bookshop on Alderman Street until the last of the evening light was gone. Then we walked home through the city that had stopped being quiet and started being ours. She submitted the essay in August, a short piece on the ethics of translation, whether the translator served meaning or was its custodian, and what the difference implied about responsibility and interpretation. And it was the strongest thing we had received all year, and also, in the 3rd paragraph, completely and specifically wrong about one thing. I wrote her an editorial letter the same evening I read it. 3 pages. I was careful and specific and not unkind. I outlined what the argument in the 3rd paragraph was doing, what it was trying to do, and where the gap between those 2 things was located. I asked 3 questions. I said the rest of the piece was extraordinary. She came downstairs the next morning. She sat in the editorial chair with the letter in front of her, and the essay open on her tablet, and she said, I read your editorial letter. I said, I know, I sent it. She said, the 3rd paragraph. I said, yes. She said, you think the argument collapses because it is trying to do 2 things. I said, it's trying to reconcile the servant reading and the custodian reading within a single paragraph. They are not reconcilable. One of them has to give. She was quiet. She was looking at the essay on her tablet with the focused attention she brought to problems she was genuinely working through rather than ones she had already solved and was presenting for confirmation. She said, the servant reading is the one that has to give. I said, yes. She said, because the custodian reading is where the actual argument lives. I said, yes. The servant reading is an argument you were having with someone else before you sat down to write this. The custodian reading belongs to the piece itself. She looked at me. I said, who were you arguing with when you wrote the 3rd paragraph? A pause. She set the tablet down. She said, a reviewer. Someone who published a response to my 2nd book, and has been wrong about translation theory, in print and in public, ever since. I occasionally write arguments at them in early drafts, and then remove them before submission. I forgot to remove it this time. I said, the piece is significantly better without it. She said, I know. She revised overnight. She sent me the new version the following morning with a single line at the bottom. The 3rd paragraph, revised, without the argument I was directing at someone who deserved less of my attention than I gave them. I read the new paragraph. It was the best thing she had written. I sent back, this is the piece. She sent back, I know. It was the most professional email exchange we had conducted in 3 months. It was also Somehow, not professional in any meaningful sense at all. The autumn issue of the Read came out in October. On the cover, for the first time in the journal's history, we ran a piece by the chair of comparative literature at St. Aldwyn's, a short essay on the ethics of translation that I had commissioned in July and edited in August, and had spent 3 weeks in September arguing with her about the third paragraph, which she had been right about, and which I had eventually conceded with the grace of someone who was practicing concession as a discipline. The editorial note at the beginning of the issue, which I wrote and she read in advance, and did not ask me to change, said the issue had been shaped by a belief that the most interesting texts were the ones that existed in the space between categories, that refused to settle cleanly into one language or one form. This was a professional statement. It was also, for anyone who knew how to read the edges, something else. She was in the audience at the launch, not in the front row, in the fourth, the same row she had chosen at the criticism panel in March, when she had wanted to watch without being watched. When I found her after the event, she said, "The third paragraph was the right call." I said, "I know. I told you that in September." She said, "You told me it was defensible." I said, "Which means right." She said, "In a limited sense." I said, "Ingrid." She said, "Yes?" I said, "You were in the fourth row." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Old habits." I said, "You don't have to watch from the back anymore." She looked at me. Something moved across her face. The thing that had been behind the composure for the whole length of our knowing each other, no longer something to be managed, but something to be inhabited. Warm and specific and entirely present, directed at me with the complete attention she had always brought to the things she cared most about. She said, "I know." We stood there for a moment in the post-launch quiet of the room, the two of us and the lamplight and the smell of warm paper and wine that was the specific smell of every literary event I had ever attended in this building. She had a glass of wine in her hand that she had not drunk, which was, I realized, exactly as it had been at the book launch in January. She had been holding a glass of wine at both ends of this particular story and had not drunk from either, which I thought was probably significant, and which I would mention to her at some point when we were not standing in a room together for the first time as whatever we actually were. She said, "The editorial note at the front of the issue." I said, "Yes?" She said, "The part about texts that refuse to settle cleanly into one language or one form." I said, "What about it?" She said, "You wrote it about us." I said, "I wrote it about the editorial philosophy of the issue." She said, "You wrote it about both." I said, "Yes, I did." The corner of her mouth, more than a millimeter, the full version of it. Outside on the Alderman Street pavement, she took my hand. Not the careful, deliberate space of June, not the awareness of something newly said, just my hand in hers, in October, in the city we had both been walking through separately for years and were now walking through together. The bookshop window was lit behind us, the chairs in rows inside. Her name on the cover in the corner display, the title catching the light. She did not look at it. Neither did I. We already knew what was in it.